I always dreaded the late shifts at the gas station. Something about the emptiness of the desert at night felt unnatural, like the land was waiting for something to happen. Friday nights were the worst, an eerie calm before the weekend rush. That night at around 11 p.m., I was restocking the fridge with bottled sodas when I saw him through the glass door. The man, if I can even call him that, looked wrong. His shoulders were hunched, his movements deliberate but off-kilter, like he didn't quite know how his body worked. He wore a tattered plaid shirt, unbuttoned halfway down his chest, revealing skin that looked waxy under the fluorescent lights. His face was pale and gaunt, the kind you'd expect to see in an old photo of someone long dead. I froze. Something about him made the hairs on my neck stand up. I told myself he was just another drifter, and probably a little drunk. I'd seen plenty of strange folks out here, and most of them just wanted to pay for gas or grab a snack. But as he shuffled inside, his eyes caught mine, and I knew this wasn't going to be like the other nights. He wandered around the store, moving slowly, almost lazily, as if he had all the time in the world. I pretended to focus on the cash register, but I couldn't stop glancing at him. He didn't seem interested in the shelves or the products. He'd pick up an item, hold it too long, then put it back with deliberate care. It felt like he was performing, like every motion was for my benefit. I told myself that people were weird, and then he started to hum. It was soft at first, just a low tuneless drone. It got louder as he moved closer to the counter. My stomach knotted as the sound wormed its way into my head, the kind of hum that felt like it could drown out your thoughts if you let it. Finally, he came to the counter, but he didn't put anything down. Instead, he just stood there staring. Up close, his face looked even worse. His skin was stretched tight over his cheekbones and his lips were cracked and dry. His smell hit me, something sour and rotten, like meat left in the sun. My instincts screamed at me to get out, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped behind the counter, with nothing but the register and a wall of cigarettes between us. He leaned in, and his humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow as he just stood there, staring at me with those dead eyes. His lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but it wasn't meant to be friendly. Then he spoke. I don't even remember the words, just a low rasping tone that made my blood run cold. The way he said it, slow and deliberate, felt like a threat. His hand came up, and I flinched, thinking he was reaching for me. But instead, he slammed it on the counter. I saw that he was holding a knife. It wasn't shiny or clean, but old and pitted, the kind you'd use to gut an animal. My legs went weak. My brain scrambled for options. The phone was on the far wall, useless. The door was behind him. I was trapped. He tapped the knife on the counter, each sound loud and deliberate, like he was waiting for me to make a move. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would explode. Then, without warning, he turned and walked towards the door. My relief was immediate, but short-lived. Halfway to the exit, he stopped and tilted his head, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Slowly, he turned back, his knife dangling from his hand, glinting dully in the harsh lights. He smiled again, wider this time, and pointed the knife at me. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was pure survival instinct, but my hand shot out and grabbed the only thing within reach, which was a heavy flashlight we kept under the counter. As he took a step towards me, I swung it as hard as I could. It connected with a sickening crack. He stumbled, the knife falling from his hand, and hit the floor. For a moment, I just stood there, panting and staring at his motionless body. Then I grabbed the knife, ran out of the store, and kept running until my legs gave out. When I finally dared to look back, the gas station was just a speck in the distance. The cops had him clear as day on CCTV, but they never found anybody in the store. I quit the next day. Some nights, I dream about his face, that awful smile, and I'm pretty sure that I'll see him again. Out here in the desert, nothing stays buried for long. It was my second month working nights at Dexter & Sons Steel, and I was settling into the routine. The hours dragged, but the job was easy, if a little boring. I spent most of my shift walking the aisles, checking that the doors were locked, and keeping an eye on the security monitors. The warehouse was enormous. It was basically a maze of steel racks and machinery, dimly lit and echoing with every creak and clang. I was making my first round when I saw her. She was standing just outside the loading dock, barely visible in the glow of the overhead floodlights. A thin woman who had long and wet hair that clung to her face. Her arms hung limply at her sides and her body was ever so slightly hunched. At first, I thought she might be hurt or lost, so I stepped outside. The night was cold and the air bit at my skin. She didn't move as I approached. In fact, she didn't react at all until I was about 10 feet away. Then her head tilted slightly, and I caught sight of her face. That's when I stopped. Something was wrong about her. She didn't look real, like she was made of some sort of plastic. My chest tightened, but I shook it off. Maybe she needed help. I raised my hand, gesturing for her to come closer. She didn't. Instead, she took jerky, uneven steps toward the open loading dock. Her feet didn't make a sound. I hesitated, and that's when she darted past me. Her speed was unnatural, her movements all wrong, like her limbs bent in places they shouldn't. Before I could react, she slipped through the door and vanished into the dark warehouse. I ran after her, my boots echoing on the concrete floor. The huge space swallowed my flashlight beam, and she was nowhere to be seen. I swept the light across the aisles, calling out for her to stop and come out. The silence in between was crushing, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then, I heard her laugh. It was faint and echoed off the steel walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I turned, shining my flashlight wildly. The laugh came again, a little louder and closer. My breath hitched as I caught a glimpse of her. She was at the far end of an aisle, her body half hidden behind a stack of crates. She was just standing there, watching me. I took a step back, my heart hammering. Her head tilted further and her wide eyes reflected the light like a cat's. Then, the overhead lights flickered, buzzing loudly before going out completely. Darkness swallowed the warehouse. I stood frozen, gripping the flashlight like it was my lifeline. Its beam was weak, barely piercing the blackness. The laugh came again, this time directly behind me. I spun around, but there was nobody there. Just rows of steel racks and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. My breath came in shallow gasps as I moved forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Every step echoed, the sound unnaturally loud. The laugh followed me, growing louder, sharper, like it was inside my own head. I turned a corner and froze. She was crouched on top of a stack of crates. Her limbs bent at impossible angles, her head twisted almost upside down, and her grin seemed to split her face in two. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the light. She didn't move, just stared, her chest heaving as if she were laughing silently. Then she was gone. I didn't see her move. 1 second she was there, and the next, the space was empty. The laugh erupted again, louder than ever, echoing all around me. I turned, running blindly through the aisles, my flashlight swinging wildly. No matter where I went, I felt her watching me. Every time I turned, I caught glimpses of her, her face peeking around a corner, her pale hands reaching out from the shadows. I ran toward the security office, desperate for a safe place, but the door was already open. The lights inside flickered weakly, and I knew she had been there. The laugh came again, this time from above. I looked up and saw her clinging to the steel beams, her body twisted unnaturally. Her head turned to face me, her grin widening. She let go, dropping to the ground with a sickening crack, but stood immediately, as if the fall hadn't hurt her. I turned and ran, my lungs burned and my legs screamed in pain. The laugh followed me, growing louder and closer. I tripped, falling hard onto the concrete floor. My flashlight skittered away, its beam spinning wildly before going out. I lay there in the dark, gasping for breath. I could hear her footsteps now, slow and deliberate, getting closer. The laugh became a rasping growl, filling the air around me. I tried to crawl, to move, but I felt her hand, a cold, claw-like grip, wrap around my ankle. She dragged me into the shadows, and the last thing I heard was that laugh, echoing in the dark. The graveyard was quiet when I arrived, and the air was heavy with damp mist. It was my first shift, and the grizzled old day worker had only one piece of advice, which was to stay in the office between 1 and 2 a.m. There was no explanation, just a flat statement before he left. I thought maybe it was some sort of joke, a way to haze the new guy. Still, something in his tone stayed with me. The office was basically a small cramped box with peeling paint and a flickering fluorescent bulb. I made my rounds and completed my checklist of tasks, heading back for coffee every hour or so. I watched the clock as midnight passed, and I wondered if this was right for me. The mist outside seemed alive, curling and shifting over the graves. The silence was quite unsettling, like you were waiting for something to happen, and at 1:30, it did. There was a faint scraping sound from outside, like nails on stone. My chest tightened, but I couldn't stop myself from looking out the window. In the distance, a figure moved through the mist. It was hooded and hunched, but glided more than walked. I picked up my radio but didn't use it. I was transfixed as this thing stopped near an old crumbling gravestone, its head tilting as if listening for something. I stayed frozen and my breath was shallow. The figure crouched and began to scratch at the ground. The sound was sharper now, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't digging, it was carving something into the dirt. My mind raced with questions I didn't want answered, namely what was it doing, and why was it here? The figure's movements were unnaturally fluid, its arms stretched and bent in ways that made my stomach churn. The mist seemed to thicken around it, cloaking its work. I should have looked away, but I couldn't. The office felt like a trap, the walls were too thin to keep anything out. The clock crept forward, each second louder than the last. At 1:45, the figure stood. Its hood turned toward the shed, and though I couldn't see a face, I felt its gaze. It raised one long arm and pointed at the window. My heart pounded and I backed away, stumbling over the chair behind me. The figure remained motionless, its arms still outstretched. Slowly, it turned back to the ground and resumed its scratching. The noise grew louder, more frantic, like a saw cutting through bone. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the desk, willing the clock to move faster. Finally, at 1:59, the figure stopped. It straightened and turned toward the shed again. The mist swirled around it, and for a moment, it seemed to dissolve into the fog. But as the clock struck 2, the sound of laughter echoed faintly, a hollow and joyless sound that sent shivers down my spine. When I finally stepped outside at dawn, the ground where the figure had been was untouched. No carvings, no disturbed dirt. But near the gravestone, something caught my eye. A small object glinted in the weak sunlight. I picked it up. It was a coin, old and tarnished. Its surface was etched with strange symbols. I left it there. I didn't want to know what it meant. I didn't want to know anything more about this place. I finished my shift, but I never went back. Some things just aren't worth the paycheck.